All right, hello and welcome. My name is Joe Toole. I'm an animator from Melbourne. And I just wanted to take this first little section here to talk about how strange it is that we're doing these talks from home, from our offices, from various places, instead of face to face with all of you. There's normally, well, I really enjoy public speaking, and there's normally like a certain amount of like back and forth that you can have with the crowd, just sensing the energy in the room and reactions from people and just the setup that is normally at places like this where there's timers and your cue cards are all on screen. All it's just fantastic, and so it feels quite strange to be doing this from my office, and I hope that we can bridge that gap together. Anyway, so the talk that I've chosen to do today is called the animation skill tree, and it's actually something that I stumbled on a little while ago during a stream that I was doing, and I've got the recording of that, and we'll watch it later. And it's anyway. Before I go too far, let's just start with a little bit about myself. Um, these are some of the things that I've worked on. Um, you can find me on Twitter. You probably see me around there, maybe not. I'm not sure. But yeah, I've had a really fun and creative first 6 years to my animation career, and I've worked on anything between games and movies, TV shows, apps. Um, and just sampled here is a few of the more potentially well-known ones. So yeah, it's been a really creatively fulfilling first 6 years, and I'm hoping to continue that trend. Right now, I'm working at Infinity Plus 2 on Puzzle Quest 3, and yeah, that's been a blast. So let's get started. So yeah, here is the Twitch clip that I created that shows where, and you can see the somewhat familiar layout that we're working with here. You can see where how I came across the idea to begin with. So let's just watch. Like the skill tree for animation skill goes up and up and up, and it just like keeps on ticking. Keep getting those animation pips, and at a certain point, you reach a point, especially with 3D animation, where you can't actually pip anymore on animation. You have to pip on tech. There's like you need to solve technical issues to be able to animate the things that you want to be able to animate. It happens pretty early actually. You're like, oh, what's the difference between IK and FK? And you need to like tech up to understand when to use IK and when to use FK. And continually this will rise, but generally this continues to rise. All the while, like storytelling, staging, acting, and personality. Personality maybe can be on a different tree. We'll just put it over here. P can be over here somewhere. Staging, acting choices. This one doesn't pip at all. This doesn't need to pip. You can become a fantastic animator, like technically very skilled, and know how to like put everything into a game engine and like whatever technical problems you need to solve you can. But you may never hit this last one. This acting choices and this uh, staging one. Right. So if there was some audio issues there where it was a little bit quiet, I'll go back and fix that in post. I promise. I promise it'll all come together in the end. But so this is sort of like where it all got started. This idea of like you can progress down one path in a particular fashion inside of animation, and it's the same in other disciplines as well. You can progress up to a certain point, and then you kind of gated based on stuff like technical knowledge or other proficiencies that are required before you can progress down that tree further. And so I thought this is like an interesting way of talking about it. And the visuals here are really limited. It's literally just me scribbling red lines on a sync sketch review, and there's even a little bit too much, I'd say, technical discussion in there, which is IK and FK and stuff like that, like more animatory terms. So I wanted to bring it back a little bit and discuss like why is it useful to talk about this, and what is there to be gleaned from figuring out what a skill tree might look like. And so let me not play this a second time. Let's just go to the next frame. So these are the questions that I wanted to answer in this talk, and I always try to think of whenever I do talks, I always try to bridge a gap. So like we're trying to get somewhere together, and these are the kind of the islands that we're trying to reach together in this talk. So how can we best learn something? This is a huge topic, obviously, and this is just one sort of I'm going to say fairly not unorthodox because it's done all the time in video games, but it's a fairly novel way of looking at this issue of learning something. And how do we know where someone is in terms of their skill within a certain discipline? So oftentimes it's hard to know exactly where to place yourself with like certain creative disciplines like animation. Like how do you tell one piece of art is better than another piece of art in creative disciplines? That can be a little bit challenging, and so this hopefully is a way to get you some of the way there. And then what do we need to know to be able to do a specific task? So like if there's something that we really need to do for a job that we need that we're going for example, it might be like creature animation for a specific type of job, then what are the steps along the way that we need to fulfill to be able to reach that point? And then why is all of this relevant? And that just sort of ties all of them together, where we end up at this this final island of discussion where we're like, okay, so now with all of these things in mind, it is clear that this is hopefully relevant. So let's continue. So why? So seniority labels, and this is where we're going to get a little bit more into the weeds. So hopefully you come along with me. So seniority labels are very rigid, I find anyway. So you can say, I'm a senior animator, and that will mean a certain thing at the studio that you're at, and it will mean nothing at another studio or another job or in another industry even. You know, like going between games and film, and this is something that I'm going to bring up a lot in the talk, is there are certain similarities between the skill that you have in animation in games versus the animation in film. However, your seniority and your um, where you are in terms of like the ladder of progressing up your career is not necessarily carried over, and so like they as a result these labels are kind of rigid when discussing like how where you are along a certain skill tree or along a certain career path. Junior, mid, senior, associate, lead, and studio are all studio specific, right? So like I said, if you're junior somewhere, that you might have been at that studio for 5 years, and so that actually translates to senior at another studio. Like it's all totally studio specific and situation specific. Qualification and conversation come down to previous experience. Shipped a game doesn't really mean very much, right? So some of these like job ads, and I think we're going to reference job ads a little bit in this talk, where they say things like you must have shipped at least one AAA game or shipped 4 games, whatever it is, you know, whatever requirement that they have, uh, doesn't really tell you the full story as to why they're asking that and what the whether or not that actually matters. In my opinion, I don't really think it does all matter all that much, because you can have worked in AAA for 8 years and all you did was model tires for a truck in a Grand Theft Auto or whatever it is. Like there's all sorts of different things that you can be involved with in AAA games and still have shipped a game, or you can have worked on a game all on your own for the last 7 years of your life and shipped a game. Like those two are um, completely different setups, and so shipped a game doesn't mean all that much when we're trying to discern how skilled someone is. And years of experience is okay, but it lacks resolution and communication can have holes, right? So like when we're talking about how many years of experience you've got, sometimes the even that doesn't necessarily tell you all that much. So like you could have done um, 10 years of film animation and just worked in like sequels and VFX movies and stuff like that. So like you don't actually have very much carry over to doing more cartoony or video game animation. Like there's a certain technical level that video game animation requires that isn't found or isn't present in most more veteran film animators. And so like years of experience in one department doesn't carry over to another, and the same thing matters across disciplines as well. I think like for taking programming, for example, and I'm speaking a little bit out of my field here, but there's different languages in programming, and your years of experience in one doesn't necessarily translate to another. There's some cross-pollination that happens there, but it's definitely not a very clear high resolution way of talking about how much skill someone has or whether or not they're ready for something. Interviews are useful, but hiring is still fraught with risk for both parties. Animation tests exist, but are often unpaid and can put undue stress on the animator, especially if they're already hired somewhere else. And so this is again what I'm talking about with like hiring. So I think maybe one of the better applications for this skill tree is to be able to have a more productive conversation with animators amongst themselves, and even recruiters with animators, and then recruiters between themselves as well. So like oftentimes you'll have a great interview and then you get asked to do an animation test, and the test might be something that you've done before, right? But they need to be able to prove, you need to be able to prove to them that you're able to do it in whatever certain style that they're trying to show, and that's perfectly fine. However, the issue at the moment is that they can be a little bit of a crutch, and so like so these animation tests are perfectly good way of gauging exactly where someone is. However, like I say here, they can be stressful, and they're often unpaid, and oftentimes they're things that would happen within the relationship between the animator and the studio within the first few months. And like that's kind of, in my opinion, why probations exist and things like that. And so again, we're sort of bumping up against like, well, what is the solution here? Like, why aren't we able to have productive enough discussions or high resolution enough discussions about where someone is in their skill level and in their like creative journey, if I want to put it that way. And I think the skill tree hopefully gets us some of the way there. Some more questions. How does one know if they're job ready? Again, if we're like going for a specific type of job and we need to know where along the sort of path we are, then a skill tree is a really like opaque way of showing like, okay, I can do X, Y, Z, but I don't quite have these other things. I need to go out and get those things. Um, what does the path for games animation look like compared to other films? So like again, cross-disciplinary, cross-industry, how do the skill tree paths differ? There's not really a whole lot of literature out there, or even spoken like talks and things like that out there where we talk about uh, the paths that you can take to be able to end up in certain points, right? So like the goal is often just become a good animator, or like become a good programmer, or become a good producer, or whatever it might be. But the path there to different disciplines and to different industries is often can be quite different, depending on how you want to do it. And also this differs between person to person, right? So the tried and true method that one person has may be different to another. And so I think this is also another really good reason to like have these like skill tree based discussions amongst specializations. So let's say you wanted to make an animation for your indie game, but you don't have the budget to hire an actual animator. How can you get by, quote unquote, on your own? Where do you start, and what does that path look like? And I think again, the skill tree is like a really nice way of saying, yes, I need to know, I need to be able to ship a game, and I don't have the ability to hire an animator or pro, whatever it might be. What steps can I take as a hobbyist to like get me across the line? Um, and the skill tree, I think, is a really good way of like framing the discussion between the hobbyist and the professional, and getting them to like have that productive dialogue where we like have concrete steps along the way, and like ways to check whether or not you're the proficiency's there. Okay, so like this is like my first take. Oh, my camera's covering it up a little bit. Let me just move this out of the way real quick. Here you go. This is like my first take at like how a skill tree could potentially look, and I think this one's probably the least appealing and least um, broad of the skill trees that I drew up for this talk. And so I've got like entry point being software basics, choosing a film or games path, and then going down tech or art, depending on what you wanted to specialize in. And so like, sure, this like shows you at a really broad perspective. Like if you wanted to end up in like games tech, you could trace your way back up, or trace your way down there and say, yeah, I need to learn how to do software basics, then I need to make a choice. And then I can say emphasis on feeling and readability for games, because it's all about like how, on reactive button presses and things like that, the things read, and also more be a little bit being a little bit more tech literate to be able to import and export stuff from engines and all that kind of thing. And then from there, you can specialize more and say, yes, we want to do tech, or we want to do art, right? So like that's like a super broad animation centric version of like what I think a skill tree could look like. And this is like my first take at it, right? And so then I made another one. I think this one's good. look how red it is in my camera. This one's good, but it's a little bit too scattershot. And so I'm gonna swap over to Canva real quick because I think it's a little bit easier to navigate over there. Cool. Okay. And so we've got oh, it follows my mouse. That's cool. So we've got like the skill tree being the central hub, and then you branch out in different directions depending on what your chosen field is. So like if you wanted to go into video games, you can branch out that way. And I think this one's a bit better, but I think it's a little bit more it doesn't cover certain things, right? So it doesn't account for like finding a job, like what exactly are like set criterias and things like that for being able to find a job, or like what about socials, like what about Twitter? It doesn't really talk about that at all, or mentors or differing advice, like I mentioned before. Like if someone has a different set of advice, I don't think this one's necessarily the easiest one to like, you know, take this structure and just like fill it in yourself. I think this one's a little bit more like my own personal sort of just like mind splatter for how I think a skill tree could look. And so like you've got things down the bottom there, like just general animation. And I think this is where I was sort of um, hitting on a little bit of like what I think is a more useful stuff. And so I've got like the 12 principles, depending on whether or not you want to go professional or hobby, and then like books that you can read, and then software choices that you can make, and then depending on which way you want to go, if you were to be like aiming to do more of like the hobbyist way, then you push more towards consultation. So you like talk a lot more with professionals. And if you want to go more professional side, then there's a lot more like rote learning. So just like doing things over and over again. I've got the tech hurdle down there, right at the bottom down here. And this is like I was saying in my little stream clip, like this is like one of those gates, right? And there's no real sense or rhyme or reason why things are a certain color in this skill tree. They're just the way they are. I thought it looked nice, but that tech hurdle really should be denoted by like a clear barrier. Like you want to be able to say, yeah, we're able to do walk cycles now, but if we wanted to progress a little bit further and start taking on these online schools, having a little bit of tech background before we can like really dive into animation and then push ourselves further here is really going to be useful. And there's also like an initial tech hurdle for engine side if you're looking to do video game stuff as well. That's like appended down the bottom there. So yeah, this was like, you know, these first two were kind of like, all right, let's see what we can come up with. Like just put the pen to the paper and see what happens. So this next one I think is closer again, but it's still not perfect, and I haven't made a perfect one. I think there's definitely room for research here on my part, and after the talk I want to go back um and perfect it a little bit more and have it a little bit more laser focused. But this is the third one that I came up with. And so this one I think it's a little bit more clear. Like if you wanted to end up being like a creative tech, like if you just scroll across the top here, like a creative tech needs to do these things, you know, like being able to have like a handle on all of these things over here is ideal. But like, and you don't really need to have a knowledge of any of the stuff over here, you know. So and then same thing goes for like if you wanted to be well-rounded animator, then you need to have these various things. And I've also noted this with this like black cross right here, or these black dashes. Like this is like a a big hurdle. It's like a gap that you need to overcome, right? So like this, if you were heading up this path of animation specifically, and you had a grasp on like walk cycles, weight shifts, and ball bouncing, before you can move on to doing like body mechanics mastery and like jumping, lifting heavy objects, all that sort of stuff, there's like a barrier that needs to be crossed. And this is like something that a lot of folks, and I'm sure that this happens a lot in other disciplines as well, but there's like a certain fundamentals sort of foundation that you need to build before you can move up. And I'm guilty of this myself, where like I moved a little too quickly. I got a little bit too excited about like the potentials of what I could be doing with animation, and went straight to like animating spiders, you know, when I should have been doing like ball bouncing and weight shifts and those sorts of things. And so I like paid the price later. I was like, okay, now I'm hitting like all of these different skill walls. When if I had have done more fundamentals earlier on, then I wouldn't have this issue. So I think this is also a really useful tool for like mentoring and stuff like that. So you can say, I'm taking this person on, they've sent me their work and they want to keep sending me their work. I'm going to keep critiquing it. Where are they in their learning journey? I really dislike using the word journey for some reason. Where are they in their learning that that we can place them and then figure out what their goal is and go from there. Like I think it's better to have it written instead of this sort of like hazy, more amorphous sort of broad goal where you can actually just say, okay, well, yeah, we're going to go for feature animation. Well, how we get there, and then you can follow the path. And even laying something like this out one-on-one, where you like go through and make choices with the mentee about how long they should be spending in specific areas. Like fundamentals, I think you can spend ages here. You can spend upwards of a year here if you really wanted to be nailing them really, really well. Like walk cycles is a huge topic, as is weight shifting. Like there's just a lot to cover, and it's not something that I would recommend anyone rush through. And then that's like a way that you can say, okay, well, now we have done a few of these things. We really should be mastering them before we move on. But instead of clamping someone's learning down and saying, no, we're not going to be able to do that, maybe you can build a section of the skill tree out here where we say, yes, we can do a little bit. We can do like a one heavy object lift and then just see how we go. And what we learn from there will be able to tell us how ready we are to progress up the skill tree even more. So like there's different, points at which we can gate this thing. And then like I mentioned in my initial Twitch stream talk, is there's like some crossover, So this one doesn't cover a whole lot of like tech side stuff. It's over here. It's all listed on this one side for clarity. But it certainly comes in on the creative side as well. But there's like these little arrows, right? And so body mechanics mastery talks a lot to understanding pantomime. Like you can't really do a pantomime shot unless you have a firm understanding of how body mechanics works. Like if you wanted to have a character walk across a room and slip on a banana and then like fall out of a window or whatever, like if that's the pantomime that you're going for, like that's the little story you're telling, then you need to know how to do all of those things within body mechanics. And before you can even begin to contemplate those things, you need to have a firm grasp of basics and fundamentals. And then there's like a bit of a crossover here as well between like pantomime and body mechanics. Like if you, it's quite hard to be able to have an idea of like what good pantomime is without having the grasp on body mechanics to begin with. And then I've got a third arrow up here pointing from body mechanics to acting with intent and purpose and appeal. So it's really challenging, again, to have any footholds or like know what you're doing even in the slightest with the creating an acting shot unless you've got a firm understanding of body mechanics. And I think there should actually be another arrow here between pantomime and acting with intent and purpose, because like one kind of feeds into the other, and even an arrow back between that one as well. So there's a lot of like feedback between specific nodes in this version of the story tree, and I really like that. I like it when the nodes talk to one another, like they're not necessarily locked off on different sections. And perhaps a better version of this would be to say, well, yeah, we can have basics fundamentals over here, but we should probably have a tech section over here where we say you can't really progress up through body mechanics, and it's more of like it's like a hidden skill tree. It's more of like a layer underneath where like the body mechanics and fundamentals aren't going to be as simple, or not as simple, but as easy to digest unless you have that firm tech understanding. And so that can be various things. It can be like how to work with specific aspects inside of a software. That could be, if you're doing programming, a better understanding of like what is allowed within a language or not allowed, and the applications of that. Like I mentioned in the talk or in the snippet, it's knowing when to use IK and AFK, things like different spaces that you can be in, world space, local space, getting a little bit too techy, but I'm gonna step back. But yeah, different technical aspects will help to further your understanding of specific parts of these different nodes. And I think definitely there's like you need to be able to like fill these circles in an order, so that you don't like run into issues where you're like trying to solve a technical problem or like animating extremely slowly because you don't know of this one technical thing that you can do to speed up that process. And so, and then there's the creative one, which I sort of briefly touched on, but there's things in here where like you can climb pretty high, like I mentioned in the Twitch clip, to being well-rounded without really having too much of an understanding of like what it takes to do good pantomime or have good storytelling. I think in order to be able to have it really shine and show yourself as like the best animator or the best craftsmanship that you can craftsman that you can be, then you need to have a little bit of everything. But like uh, certainly you can do creatures and understand flight and do mythical invented creatures without knowing good storytelling, right? I think those creatures that you might be animating and the way in which you animate them would be improved, right, by the good storytelling and the having a better technical understanding, but you don't necessarily need it. Like I said, it's more like a shadow or a sub graph that you're looking at underneath that sort of helps or pushes and improves. And so I think this one, like as you can see, like I've sort of gone on quite a bit with this one. This one is the probably the most useful one I think that I created. And like I said earlier, there's more to be done here. Like I said, that it's missing this underlying subgraph of like how things cross-pollinate a little bit more and certain technical aspects. And with the one way earlier, this one right here, it doesn't go into like how differing advice could affect things, how personal mentors play into this. It doesn't talk about like qualifications for specific job types. There's all sorts of things that I really wanted to build into these skill trees, but I just didn't get to. Like I think it's a huge topic, and a lot of this is going to come from, as I said right at the beginning, these professions talking to one another and having this as like a framework for how we could be leveling one another up. Let's go back to the chat. So all of this is to say that skill tree I don't think is necessarily like a catch-all, but rather a novel, an interesting way to repose the question of where are you in a skill journey. It's also very much useful for finding a good path to follow to reach a certain goal. So this is all stuff that I was talking about earlier, but I just wanted to sort of, nail it in here and say, I think there's more work to be done here, and I don't think it's necessarily the work of one person. I think it's like a jumping off point, and an interesting way to have conversations about like where you are in your skill and your craft, and how that actually applies with other disciplines as well. And so that's hopefully an interesting way to like have conversations about this instead of just being like, oh, I'm a films animator and I've been doing it for 5 years. It's like this doesn't tell me much. Okay, so now I've got some examples, and I just want to get like in the last few minutes here going. I realize I'm running out of time a little bit, but I just want to spend the last few minutes here going through and discussing like how I would approach where these certain these animators would be in their skill, right? So this is a shot that someone sent me for review. They're trying to get into an academy, and the academy had given them a test, right? So in order to be accepted into this school, you need to be able to have a certain proficiency, which is a bit interesting, but cool. And so this is a very common VFX exercise: is take some reference and take a creature rig and make them look identical. It's called rotomation. And like this is this animator's first attempt at it. And so I can see there's a whole heap of things, a whole host of things missing here, from basic body mechanics understanding to being able to read the reference, like knowing what to look for inside of the reference, as well as how creatures move and matching directions. There's like lots of things that this particular animator needed to sort of cover to be able to get to a certain point in their animation where they could improve on this. And so as I was giving them notes, they were coming back repeatedly with new versions, and the versions had covered everything that I had mentioned, but they hadn't like gone further. And so that's another sign as a mentor, it's that this particular animator needs to go back and cover more basic fundamentals, because if I give a note that's sort of supposed to be applicable to a whole bunch of other things in the shot, and even if I mention that, they'll only tackle the one note on that particular part of the animation. And so they ended up submitting this one, and this isn't the final one, but it was pretty close to it. And so this is after the notes that I'd given them. still has issues, but I think it's much, much closer to reference. It has way more similar energy. There's some little mechanical issues in the tail as in animating and various other things, but you can see how like they've sort of climbed up that sort of creature proficiency aspect of the skill tree. And then next. So this is an animator's reel that I reviewed on a stream once, and it just covers some of the like. This is what I was talking about before about, and I'm guilty of this, is jumping ahead too fast in trying to learn something, and this is kind of like what you get. And turn the sound off. Oh.
Please don't go this way.
No, you're still holding on. Let go.
Right, so there's all sorts of things happening here. There's like multiple character, and we only catch the end of it here, multiple character interactions going on, which is like really complicated body mechanic stuff. Like if we were to go back and look at this skill tree again, it's like, so body mechanics, I would put it right up the top here, even above climbing, falling, jumping. There would be another pip here for two character interactions. The minute that a character is interacting with something, let's just say the ground, things become quite complicated. The minute that two characters are interacting with one another in like a meaningful way, like they're fighting or grappling like they are in that clip, it just becomes super duper complicated because you've got forces acting on other forces, not based purely on momentum, but based on like core strength and things like that. So there's like all sorts of complicated things that this animator just hadn't anticipated when they created this piece, right? And so it's a valiant effort, but I said, really, I'm only going to put notes on parts of this animation reel that I think are things that you should keep, and I think you should just throw out the rest. And this is, if ever there, and I'm not trying to have a go at this animator at all, if ever there were a way to show that you don't have a firm grasp on the basics, then I think this clip covers it. And then they go and do some acting, right? And so like acting requires you to have really good body mechanics knowledge and really firm basics before you can start to tackle it. And then you also need to have a little bit of, let me just go back in the skill tree. This is perfect, right? This is why I put these practical examples here. In order to be able to do some acting with intent and purpose, you really need to have a good grasp on pantomime, which leans on body mechanics and storytelling, like knowing how to put together a well-staged shot. And then like, all of this is hinging on the basics as well. And so, this animator had a really hard time putting these notes, putting these shots together and being able to like execute on them, right? Like it's a good start, but it's definitely not there. And so my advice was we really want to go back, master the basics. I want to see you do a bouncing ball. I want to see you do a weight shift. Here's like where you should be right now. Here's another example, right? I think this is like a pretty good attempt, like I think this is really showing we have some good running here. There's some good contact with this wall. There's a little bit of like speedy kind of flashy animation going on here, but when I say flashy, I mean like just the space between each different pose is a little bit too wide. Up here at the top, kind of feels like a jumble of limbs, but so in terms of where they are in their skill journey, like I think they're quite far along and they've got a good understanding of the basics. But there's more time that needs to be spent in this like body mechanics section, like I would have them do way more of these exercises. There's another clip here. So this one's showing like a little bit of pantomime and some kind of funky, cool body mechanic stuff. And you can tell just based on how like weighty things feel, the way the head's reacting to the body, the way that there's things sort of jiggling and moving around, and this character isn't completely frozen still when they're just holding a pose. Like there's all sorts of things here that are like cluing me off to say like, okay, this person has the skill to back up the sort of shot that they're doing right here. And that's always good to see. Next. This final one I thought was just really cool. It's just in blocking, like it's not a finished animation, but they're really showing like some cool things here where there's just like an implied rope or like their boosters are going off or something. And it just feels really nice and weighty. And there's no story being told here really, which, you know, like I said earlier on in the skill tree, like you don't need to necessarily need to have good storytelling or staging or whatever to be able to have nice animation. And I think this is a prime example of that. So just to circle back around, and we're coming up right to the end here, so that's great. How best can we learn something? I hope that we covered that. I hope that we now have, like, you know, points in the distance that we can point to with the skill tree and have conversations with people about how we can best learn something with this approach. How do we know where someone is in terms of their skill within a certain discipline? So like I was just showing with those examples, I think having the skill tree as just like a conversation piece in the back, or like a way that we can present to the animator where they are as like a point, like it's almost like an anchor. It helps them feel out where exactly they are in their journey and know where they're going to be going next and where they've come from. So I think it's a really good map. And then what do we need to be able to do to complete a specific task? Like I said before, there's heaps of different prerequisite things in order to be able to reach goals that you might have in mind, whether or not hobbyist or whether or not you're a professional aiming to do certain things within a field. The skill tree, I hope, is a really nice way to just like have clarity around those things and put them in order. And I hope all of this has been really relevant. And so that's it. That's the last frame. I'm gonna leave it there. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope it wasn't too dry for you, and I hope it wasn't too animatory. But even if you are an animator and you're watching this, I hope you have a lot to talk about now with your fellow animators. And if you're not an animator, I hope that you have a new tool to build out your own version of what a skill tree could look like as a professional. And if you're a beginner or if you're you know, a veteran, I hope this goes out into the discussion and into the ether a little bit, and we start seeing some more productive, positive, interesting discussions and conversations around skill and how things are learned. And yeah, that's it. Thank you very much. I'll see you next time. Have questions after. All right. Thank you. Bye bye.